Tonight's lesson is titled Daring to Trust the Spirit of God, a Life Worth Living. And it's a story about Joshua and the time and the place where he lived, and also the nation of Israel, because the story of Joshua and the story of Israel is intertwined. I must admit, when I started studying for this lesson, if you had to ask me, tell me everything you know about Joshua, there's a lot of things I would not have been able to tell you that we're going to cover tonight. And I think, hopefully, by the end of this lesson, you will have learned a lot about Joshua and a lot about yourself and the challenges that we face, similar to the ones he faced. Just think for yourself now. What do you know about Joshua? I think most of us know he's the one with the story of be strong and courageous. But there's a lot of things I certainly didn't know, and if you just take it all in one go, a lot of different pieces of the puzzle come together. Before we start, let's look at the time and the place in which this guy came onto the scene. Read with me from Deuteronomy chapter 12, from verse 28. And the scene is that God chose Israel to be his nation in a time and a place where they weren't anything special. He made them special. He chose them to be special. And he sent them to go to a country called Canaan, which was exceptionally ungodly. And there's a key part of this lesson tonight, is that Canaan was not just any place. They were remarkably ungodly, and for that reason, God had decided that he will destroy them. And for that is how he had used Israel to destroy them. Not because Israel was great or anything special, but because of what Canaan had done. Deuteronomy chapter 12 from verse 28 says, be careful to obey all these regulations I am giving you. This is God speaking to Israel, so that it may always go well with you and your children after you, because you will be doing what is good and right in the eyes of the Lord your God. The Lord your God will cut off before you the nations you are about to invade and dispossess. But when you have driven them out and settled in their land, and after they have been destroyed before you, and you look at the key word here, they've been destroyed before you. Israel did not do the conquering. God did it for them. Lest they think they were great and fantastic and exceptionally special people. He just used them in his greater plan. Be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. And there's a lesson on its own. Sometimes people think that, well, what I've been doing now is becoming a bit stale now. I'm going to see what others do and then try that out without wisdom. And certainly when Israel tried out some of the things that these Canaanites were doing, they were doing it without wisdom. Let's read further. How do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. You must not worship your God in their way, because in worshipping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifice to their gods. See that you do all I command you. Do not add to it or take away from it. And there's another lesson for us. And that is that the answers that we are looking for is all available in God's Word. It is, I think sometimes in Christianity today, all over the world, it is easy to, if you think about the pendulum of a clock, in our fear of being like this, we can sway the pendulum too far this way. And there's also a danger. We must stick to what God has in mind for us. We must not, almost like a knee-jerk reaction, sway this way because we just don't want to be like them or like that. And you can fill in the details for yourself. There are many, many examples of that. So in this context, Joshua steps into the scene. Just to give you some background, I couldn't figure out why anybody would do this type of thing. I cannot imagine why any human being would sacrifice children to a afgod. What is a demigod. And I tried to find out, what's this all about. And the Canaanites had a god called Molech, and many of them practiced this. And apparently it was for something that's like completely ungodly application of what God had in mind. God's words about this was, if anybody in Israel is caught serving another god in this way, they must be stoned and taken out of the Israel camp. And there are many things that God told them people must be stoned for and be taken out of the camp. And that is a lesson to me as well. When God tells them in the start, be careful to obey all the things I'm giving you so that it may go well with you, He really means what He says. He actually wants us to know carefully what He wants us to do, how He wants us to live, because it really does matter to Him. He's not wishy-washy about, no, this is okay and that's not so bad. He's very clear about what He wants. Let's talk about Joshua's life and who he was. Joshua was born into this society that had to deal with very ungodly practices amongst the people around them, which was influencing them. His name when he was born was Hoshea, which means salvation. And then when Moses renamed him, he named him Joshua. And so he was born salvation, and then Joshua means God saves. So you can hear the link there. It's not just salvation, but that God saves. Interestingly, when the Bible was translated and when the New Testament was written, the Greek word for Jesus is the same as the Hebrew word Joshua. And trust me, there are people today who make quite a hoo-ha of that you must call Jesus by the Joshua or Yeshua, or you make it as you will name, that you can't call him Jesus. But that is, again, people making rules where God did not make them. In history, Joshua went through some remarkable things. Imagine yourself in his shoes. He was there in Egypt when they were still slaves. So he saw all that. He experienced all that. He was a slave at one stage in his life when he was very young. He saw the 10 plagues, went through all that, saw it all. He crossed the Red Sea with the Israelites, saw all of those miracles. And then God decided that Joshua will become Moses' successor. And when you're in a business, they talk about succession planning, that you need to train those you need to follow from quite young. And Joshua was being trained from quite young to follow up in Joseph's footsteps. I didn't know that he spent 40 days and 40 nights with Moses on Sinai when Moses was given the stone tablets, the law. I always thought Moses was up there on his own. I don't know about you, but he was there with Moses in those 40 days. Let's read together from Exodus chapter 24 what it says. Exodus 24 from verse 13 says, Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide. And already here the Bible calls him Moses' aide. He is his helper. He's learning from the top man, Moses himself. He's seeing all the mistakes that Moses is making, and he's learning through Moses from God of what God's going to expect of him one day. Joshua is aide, and Moses went up the mountain of God. He said to the elders, Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in the dispute can go to them. And again, remarkably, how often there's patterns in the Old Testament that repeats itself in the New Testament. Joshua was with Moses on Sinai when the first law was given to mankind, or to Israel, for 40 days and 40 nights. Joshua's name sounds like Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus was in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. And so we'll see a couple of other similarities coming through the lesson. Then, here's a sea change in Israel's history. God tells them, He's taken them out of Egypt, they're in the desert, and God tells them, I've decided that these Canaanites have been ungodly for too long, and I will destroy them, and you will help me do it. And He sends 12 spies into Canaan to go spy out the land. And yet, of the 12, as you know, 10 come back and say, we can't do it, it's impossible. Let's just read a piece of that history and what key role Joshua played in this history of Israel. I'm reading from Numbers chapter 14, from verse 26 onwards. Numbers 14, from verse 26. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, how long will this wicked community grumble against me? They've come back now and they've decided, despite God promising us that He'll give us victory, we don't think so. We're not going to trust the Creator of the universe, who's just brought us out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, has fed us in the desert, etc., etc. No way, He can't do it. I've heard the complaints these grumbling Israelites have. So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you this very thing I heard you say. In this desert, your bodies will fall. Because they were saying, God, we're going to die here. So, okay, is that what you think is going to happen? Then that's what's going to happen. Every one of you, 20 years old or more, who was counted in the census and has grumbled against me, not one of you will ever enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. Here Joshua comes up again. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But your bodies will fall in this desert. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the desert. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land. You will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you. Interesting, Jesus was also in the desert for 40 days. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will surely do these things to the whole wicked community, which is banded together against me. They will meet their end in this desert. Here they will die. Think about how history would have been had the Israelites trusted God that day. They would have been in Canaan 40 years earlier, and all of these other people, including Moses, would have been there. But alas, that was not meant to be. And this illustrates to me how some of the choices that we make certainly changes things for a long, long time. I know when I was studying, I was first studying something completely different. I studied BSc Agriculture because at that stage I thought I would like to do research in plant genetics, develop corn that is drought resistant, and I think maybe under current circumstances they might have been a good choice. And then I changed to civil engineering. And I remember at the time how I felt that this change is going to have a sea change forever. And choices that we do make sea changes for a long time. In this instance, Israel's choice not to trust God changed everything for always for everybody over 20. And I think each one of us can think of cases in our lives where we chose for or against God, and how that choice affected us for a long, long time afterwards. Luckily, by God's grace and through His almighty power, He can help us, go anywhere in the end after all. But the choices we make certainly do affect us for a long time afterwards. Joshua, as one of the few who trusted in God, had a reputation. In Numbers 27, we read that when God told Moses, Joshua must be the guy that follows you up, He calls Joshua by this title. He says, a man in whom is the Spirit. And he was known as somebody who trusts in God. Ask yourself, in your life at home, does your wife regard you as somebody who trusts in God? Does your husband regard you as somebody who trusts in God? At work, would they be surprised to hear that you trust in God, or is it clear to all because of the way we live? And can we pattern our lives on Joshua and the things that he's gone through? The next thing I wanted to cover is on the same topic, but it's not as much about Joshua's life, but rather about the idea of war. When I was living in Holland, one of my colleagues were quite aggressively against religion and against God. And I know that there are many people like that. And in his specific case, he often tried to use examples from the Bible to substantiate why you cannot serve God and he can't exist in any case, because he is a cruel God. And many of the examples that he chose is from the Old Testament, where he would argue that look at how God destroyed people like the Canaanites. Look at how he sanctioned the wars that the Israelites fought against the Canaanites. How can that be a loving, just, fair God? And often such arguments come from a very small knowledge about the Bible. We just know a couple of verses. You went to a website, the website agrees with your point of view, and voila, you are substantiated. Look there, the website agrees with me. But the bigger picture that we're looking at tonight is that God was by no means unfair, and that he did not sanction war per se of the Israelites. He won the war for them. Why? Because of the reasons that I gave you earlier, that the Canaanites were remarkably ungodly. It's not just one nation, it's several nations that lived in that area. A remarkably ungodly set of nations that God says again and again, I will obliterate them before me because they are so ungodly, and they were clearly unrepentant. Read with me from Joshua chapter 21. Some of the context of why God allowed this war to be won. Joshua 21 talks about how it wasn't about the guys on the ground at that time. It wasn't about the Israelites fighting that war, because God was winning it for them anyway. It was about how he promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob decades, many, many years before that, literally hundreds of years before that, that one day, through their descendants, God would have a nation that he would choose from the nations to illustrate to everybody that he is in control. He could have chosen any nation, let's be honest. It didn't have to be the Israelites. But he chose them as a small nation, an insignificant nation, to illustrate to everybody in that area, and ultimately today to all of us, that he can use anybody, any nation, lowly as you can get, as fickle as you can get. Let's be honest, the Israelites proved to us they're as fickle as all of us can be, and that through them still he can show the world that he is in charge, that he does love us, and that he is almighty, and that he's willing to do everything to pull all of us to him. Let's read a bit about this promise that he gave. In Joshua chapter 21, verse 43, this is now after we've read a lot about Joshua's life, and we read the following. 43 says, So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their forefathers, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their forefathers. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord handed all their enemies over to them. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to the house of Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. It was about an eternal promise, a promise that we today even benefit from through Jesus Christ, the descendants of Abraham, and the promise that in the end goes to everybody on this earth of eternal life, and promises that God, when he makes a promise, he will definitely keep it. The second one was, God didn't tell them, okay, now you're first going to take over Canaan, and then you're going to go take over Egypt, and then we'll go up north, we'll go do Babylonia after that, and so we'll keep going. It wasn't about a worldwide empire. It was about a place for them to stay, and a place for them where they could worship God in peace, which he promised to them. And to the extent that they kept to God's laws and his promises, they had peace. And every time they did not, peace was lost, and one of the enemies defeated them again. An example of this is we read in Joshua chapter 7, where when they took the land, God told them, nothing of this is going to be yours. Whatever you find in anybody's house or any city, it's not yours. You must devote it to the Lord. And we all know of how easy it is when you get something for nothing to just hold on to it. I mean, it's one thing if you work hard for it, but if you get something great for nothing, that temptation of just to hold on to it is incredibly big. And many of you would know the story of Achan and how when he got something for nothing, he couldn't let go. Read with me, Joshua chapter 7, verse 1 says, "But the Israelites acted unfaithfully in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel." And then from verse 19 to 22. So Achan takes something and Israel loses a very big battle. And they start trying to find out, God, how could we lose? We were on a winning streak all along and suddenly we lose badly. And they start an investigation. And then we get down to chapter verse 19. It says, now they're trying to find out who did this wrong thing. Verse 19 says, "Then Joshua said to Achan, 'My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and give him the praise. Tell me, what have you done? Do not hide it from me.' Achan replied, 'It is true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I have done. When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground inside my tent with the silver underneath.'" This morning we spoke, the Lord's Supper was about how money is the root of all evil. And what a classic example of how greed led to several things. Deceit. He deceived many people around him. I don't believe that it's possible to hide all the stuff in your tent without your inner circle knowing about it. So probably that deceit spread to more than just him. And then in the end, they were punished for it. And the object lesson here is that when God says, "I want something done in this way," He has His reasons. And when people in this community in Israel deviated from it, everybody suffered. And that is also it's a theme that comes through in the whole book of Joshua often. What you do is never just going to influence you. What I do will never just influence me. It always has knock-on effects on my family, on the church, you name it. The ripple effect is always much bigger than we realize, just as what happened here with Achan. And when you think of your own life, when you think of that moment when you must choose between right and wrong, I think when we realize the ripple effect of our choices, we will be far more careful to choose the right thing. Because then there will be far more of a realization in the sense of this, whatever choice I must make now, cannot compete with the consequence of how this will affect my family, my future, my children one day, the church, everybody else. The scales, I think, just starts tipping the other way a lot more quickly if we realize the consequences that we have. And then lastly, the part that we all know about Joshua, being strong and courageous. Read with me Joshua chapter 1 from verse 1 to 9. This is the intro of the whole lesson which we're doing right at the end. This is where Joshua suddenly is shoved to the front, where God says, "This is time, Joshua, you've got to lead now." Joshua chapter 1 verse 1 says the following: "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, 'Moses, my servant, is dead.'" He died, and God climbs right in and says, "It is time. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the great sea on the west. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." Have you ever had an instance where you just become small in front of God, in front of His greatness, His grace, His goodness, and His unmeasurable love for you. I think Joshua must have felt extremely small at this moment, where God, through him, promises to Israel these wonderful things far in excess of what they could deserve, far in excess of what they could achieve on their own, and far in excess of what one could say is reasonable. And yet God promised it to them, not because of what they were, but because of what He is. And that's what He does for us daily, through the way He deals with us, through how He pulls us constantly towards Him, not for anything that we've done to deserve it, but because of who He is. Verse 6 says, "Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give to them." Going back to where this all started, God promised it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not necessarily to each of these individual people. They were part of the whole story. Verse 7, "Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you." And here's the crux: "Do not turn from it to the left or to the right, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it." God knows us all too well. And He knows very well that we forget quickly. And He knows that we need repetition, and He knows that we need each other. They couldn't do it on their own. They needed each other. They couldn't do it if they didn't regularly climb into His Word and find out what does God want from us. And you can't just read about it. You've got to think about it. He says meditate on it day and night. Now that's very different from just before you go to sleep reading and you're gone. There's a lot of self-application needed if you meditate about something. You really got to measure yourself against what is written down when you're meditating about it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. God knows us very well. He knows that we have ups and downs, and He knows that sometimes we will get discouraged. It's a reality. But because He is God and because He made us, He puts things in place to help us even when we are discouraged. He gives us His Word, He gives us each other, and He gives us family and Christian friends that we can talk to when we are discouraged. And He gives us a promise far in excess of anything we can imagine. Do not be terrified and do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Tonight, I hope you have, just like me, seen through the life of Joshua, how God has a plan far greater than any individual's life. Joshua was one cog in this whole machinery that God had planned from before Abraham's days. But Joshua rose to the challenge when God told him to be strong and courageous. He did what God wanted, and Israel was victorious. And that is why today we can benefit to read about the life of a man who was willing to lift his life far above ordinary to do what God expected from him. We have a chance every day to lift our lives far above ordinary, to trust Him and take Him at His word when He says He is in control. I love it. Krishna's got on a WhatsApp, what do you call it? You know, this little thing that you can put at the bottom of WhatsApp. Her WhatsApp quote is, "God is in control." And for me, that's quite a reminder that yes, it doesn't actually matter what happens. God is in control. As He was for Joshua, He is for us today. Thank you.